is a quite vast topic, and it is very difficult to sum up all the aspects of it, but I have tried as far as possible to stress on those parts which are usually not studied or maybe encountered in a day-to-day life. There will be special stressing which will be on the genetics and the immunological factors, as well as the investigations and the treatment based on the evidence available. So we will be discussing all. Let us proceed. First of all, the first question that comes in our mind is, what is recurrent implantation failure? Where does it occur? And how to treat the recurrent implantation failure? We will be studying this vast topic under the following headings, that is introduction, which will include the definition, incidence and impact, the etiology, investigations, treatment and conclusion. First of all, we should be able to define recurrent implantation failure. There is no universally accepted definition. I have put here some definitions of recurrent implantation failure which has been used in various studies, and I have also enumerated the studies. Like in 2012 by Simon and Lawford, this definition was given, in which they had defined failure of implantation after 3 consecutive IVF attempts or transfer of at least 4 good quality embryos in a woman under the age of 40 years. The same criteria was used in another study by Kuglan and et al. In 2013. Another definition which was given as failure of implantation after 2 consecutive cycles after transfer of at least 4 good quality embryos or blastocysts, which was given by Polanski et al. In 2014. Another important definition which we usually use to define recurrent implantation failure was in terms of 3 or more unsuccessful IVF cycles or the failure of conception after replacement of 10 or more good quality embryos. This is the most popular of the definitions which we use in defining recurrent implantation failure, but we should remember one thing which I have stressed in my previous slide, that recurrent implantation failure is not the same as recurrent IVF failure. It is a subgroup of recurrent IVF failure. So other definitions are also there. The Polanski one I had just elucidated a few moments ago, and there was a very funny definition, but it's like, it's recurrent implantation failure only if it looks like, sounds like, then only it's recurrent implantation failure. So there is no universally accepted definition for it. The incidence is about 10% of the IVF cycles worldwide. Why is it of such an importance to us? Because as we all know, it is of quite stress to the couples. Finding the cause for RIF becomes a source of frustration for the doctor. It increases the cost of the procedure, and the management also poses a major challenge to the clinicians. Now let us first move on to the etiology. Etiology may be broadly divided into endometrial, gamete or embryo related, and multifactorial. So if we divide the responsibility or the etiological factors into these 3 categories, we find that among the gamete related issues, gamete or embryo related issues, 80% of them are related with that of egg. Egg related aneuploidy or chromosomal issues account for 80% of it. Sperm factors, sperm aneuploidy or increased fragmentation accounts for 10% of the factors, and embryo related factors, whether it is poor quality embryos or uterus related factors, accounts for about 10% of it. So majority or the major chunk of recurrent implantation failure is dealt in the gamete related issues with egg. Now let us enumerate all the factors one by one. First of all, we'll come to the anatomic causes. Anatomic causes, as we know, includes polyps, fibroids, adhesions, septum, etc. Now, these are all mechanical factors, and apart from causing mechanical obstruction in the meeting of the sperm and the egg, there is also impaired functioning of the endometrium as a result of thin endometrium, which may occur due to adhesions. There is altered expression of the adhesion molecules. There is adhesion molecules like integrin, alpha 1, alpha 4, alpha 5, beta 3. All these are adhesion molecules which become altered in case of any intracavitary lesions, whether it is fibroid, whether it is polyp, etc. And this result in failure of implantation. there is thrombophilias. Thrombophilia is a broad group of diseases in which there is clotting associated abnormalities, as a result of which the blood supply gets hindered. So this is an important subgroup of patients. As a result of insufficient blood supply to the endometrium, the implantation failures occur. And immunological factors. Immunological factor I will be discussing in my subsequent slides in detail. Now, gamete or embryo related factors, it may be chromosomal anomalies, which may be either of the sperm or the egg, poor quality oocyte, poor quality sperms. It may be due to zona hardening. Zona hardening is an important factor for which many times, as it is a natural phenomenon, zona hardening occurs in natural conception also in order to prevent polyspermy. But if it is in excessive amounts, so that the hatching cannot occur, as a result of which implantation failure might occur. There might be suboptimal culture conditions, suboptimal embryo quality, and suboptimal embryo transfer technique. So all these are gamete or embryo related factors. Some of this we will be discussing in detail in our subsequent slides.
Shubhdeep, can you, just to interrupt you, can you be a bit louder? Some people are not able to hear you. Just a little.
Yes, sir. Am I audible now? Am I audible now?
Yeah, better.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
So in the multifactorial causes, we have endometriosis, hydrosalpingus, and suboptimal ovarian stimulation. All these are dealt with separately in the subsequent slides, but I will just elaborate in a few sentences. In endometriosis, since it is a multifactorial disease, there is altered expression of the adhesion molecules, as well as altered blood supply, as well as the delicate balance between the various inflammatory markers like cytokines, interleukins is disbalanced, as a result of which implantation is hampered. In hydrosalpingus, there is a direct toxic effect of the fluid. Apart from this, there is suppression of the leukemia inhibitory factor, which is an important factor in implantation. And also there is altered integrin expression, as a result of which there is failure of implantation. In ovarian stimulation, if it is not optimal, say in normal controlled ovarian stimulation, there is supraphysiological levels of serum estrogen, as a supraphysiological levels of estrogen, as a result of which there is altered pinopod expression, or there is luteal phase defect, as a result of which the implantation might get hampered, or after implantation it is not supported, so it might cause recurrent miscarriages also. So these were the causes in short. So if we look into the matter that why does implantation fail? Now, this is a very important thing. Like, implantation failure can occur in 3 stages. Either there is failure to conceive, conception has occurred, but it has failed to thrive, or it has initiated but not completed implantation, because there is no as such test available till date which can tell us whether implantation has occurred or not. So there is no in vivo marker of conception till date. Now, as I said, in our presentation, we'll be focusing on the genetics and the immunological part more than the other aspects. Let us look at the genetics of the implantation. The embryo is a foreign material for the mother, because 50% of its genetic material in case of self-conception comes from the father, which is a foreign antigen. And if we consider donor cases, suppose that the patient is going with donor egg or embryo donor, then 100% of the genes are foreign for the mother. Now, as we know, in case of antigen presentation related issues, HLA genes play an important part in cross-matching of the antigens, and this histocompatibility antigens determine the amount of immune response showed by the mother towards the embryo. So if there is immune rejection of the embryo, and then there will be immunological response on the part of the mother, as a result of which failure of implantation or recurrent miscarriages might occur. Now, in this context, I would like to stress that many of the causes of recurrent implantation failure are similar to the causes of recurrent miscarriages, because this initial period of implantation and growth in the first trimester are governed by similar set of factors. Therefore, some of the causes do overlap. So these are the major HLA antigens, which are HLA A, B, C, D antigens, which are found in both the donor, that is the mother, as well as the embryo. How is this HLA incompatibility dealt with? It is mainly because of the presence of trophoblast or placenta in between. Trophoblast or placenta, as we know, is a unique tissue which expresses unique set of HLA antigens, which are of E, F, and G types. They have a immunosuppressive effect, so they are more termed as pseudogenes, because unlike HLA A to D genes, which are polymorphic, extremely variable, and are reasons for immune rejection, HLA E, F, and G are monomorphic, and they result in immune suppression or immune tolerance rather. So what do we know about the genetics of recurrent implantation failure? That is the haploidentity. That is 50% of the genes are from the mother. It will be a critical factor for implantation and further course of pregnancy. But the other groups of HLA, apart from HLA A to D, are also of importance. The higher the identity, like HLA sharing, the more unfavorable constellation is procreated. So that's why consanguinity is detrimental as a result of it might cause immune rejection from the mother. So the sum up may be the more different, the better. Like oocyte donation or embryo donation or surrogacy, the more the HLA genes are different, it is better for implantation. Even in cases of high HLA sharing, there is chance of a favorable constitution and uncomplicated pregnancy. But as I had said in the previous slide also, there is no test to determine so, and no test to detect implantation as such. So regarding the immunological part, 3 types of receptors that we see is usually killer immunoglobulin-like receptors, which are present on the natural killer cells. What are natural killer cells? We'll come to know in the next few slides. Lymphocyte immunoglobulin-like receptors, which are present on the lymphocytes. Natural killer and lecithin-like receptor cells, which are directed towards the natural killer cells. So the natural killer cells are the specialized form of cells which are found only inside the uterine. Natural killer cells are found inside the endometrial lining only. They're characterized by CD56 antigen, which may be bright or dim time depending on their staining types, and this plays an important role in immune rejection of the embryo. We'll see in the subsequent slides how. So these are the 3 important types of receptors directed or found on this type of cells which are involved in the process of implantation. Now, what do we know presently is that not all of these receptors are genetically determined, and only 3 to 4% of the humans possess the killer immunoglobulin-like receptors. Genetic determination and the degree of expression of this, there is a delicate balance in the expression and non-expression, or the expression of this 3 types of receptors, which might provide a favorable milieu for implantation. There are some test kits which are available to test the presence of killer immunoglobulin-like receptors, but it might not be commercially viable to test for such, in such cases, because test results are either not very accurate or these are commercially not viable because of their increased cost. So what is the function of HLA, E, F, and G? They are mainly inhibitory, as I had told. So they help in development of immune tolerance. That is, the mother's body doesn't react to the embryo as a foreign antigen, and the uterus or specifically the placenta becomes a privileged site where the immune responses are not active. Diagnostic remark which we can make is that HLA, E, F, and G possess different isoforms, and they are of 50% maternal and 50% paternal allele. And these isoforms are of varying effectivity and determine the implantation potential of the embryo. Genetic testing for this HLA antigens is possible, but is not included routinely in our diagnostic tests. Regarding the cytokines and the growth factors, so here I have enumerated all the important immunological factors, especially the cytokines, interleukins, factors which are involved in implantation. So those which are marked in blue, like interleukin 2 and TNF alpha, they have an inhibitory role on implantation. So increased levels of interleukin 2 or TNF alpha is detrimental for implantation and is usually associated with implantation failure. There are strategies to deal with this also, which will come in the treatment part. And those which are marked in green, like GCSF, interferon alpha, CSF1, leukemia inhibitory factor, GM-CSF, all are supportive to implantation. So this favorable milieu is very much essential, and any imbalance in this, like an increase in TNF or a dip in LIF, might be associated with recurrent implantation failure. So there is definitely the embryo is not inactive. There is active communication between the embryo and the mother, which sends positive signals for the trophoblast development, and as a result of which there is subsequent development of an immunoprivileged site. If there is insufficient communication or lack of send of these positive signals, then it results in either failure of implantation or there are recurrent miscarriages. Various supplementation of the culture media, like supplementation with recombinant GM-CSF, are available, but these are off-label, and routinely what we are doing is we're administering it to the patient instead of supplementing into the media. And the support is necessary only till the trophoblast or the placenta is autonomous. That is, transition usually occurs around 9 or 10 weeks of gestation. So till then, this support is needed. So more studies or more knowledge into this maternal-fetal or maternal embryo dialogue is needed to comment on this. From this genetic part, what conclusions can we draw? The presence of an embryo is communicated as a foreign HLA group. Usually 50% of this are from the father, and 50%, and in case of embryo or oocyte donation, it may be up to 100%. In order to avoid the rejection of the embryo, the trophoblast builds a neutral zone so that the maternal immune responses are not able to reach this foreign implant. In this hidden position, the uterine natural killer cells become activated, and these are specialized cells which have an immunosuppressive effect. Natural killer cells, which are also present in our peripheral blood cells, usually are cytotoxic. These are different from the peripheral natural killer cells. They have an immunosuppressive effect and prevent the immune rejection of the embryo. Regarding the immune cells, as I had enumerated, after 6 to 7 days of ovulation, 60 to 70% of the free endometrial cells are uterine natural killer cells. They stain brightly on staining for cluster differentiation 56 gene. They appear as large granular leukocytes and contain granules of active materials. And in case of any infection or in terms of rejection, usually the B and T lymphocytes number then increases. Normally, when the pregnancy is continuing in an uncomplicated manner, the B and T cells are not in predominance and they are of not much importance. But if there is an infection or there is a problem, then this B and T lymphocyte population increases, and the population of peripheral or cytotoxic natural killer cells also increases. So the balance shifts in favor of the harming cells, you may say. So for implantation, uterine natural killer cells are of importance, and they usually do not have any cytotoxic activity. They have high synthesis of cytokines and growth factors, which are stored in these granules. That's why the name large granular leukocytes. Cytotoxic natural killer cells, which are present in the peripheral blood, and they are responsible for the immunosurveillance of the infections, and specifically viral infections and malignant cells. They account for only 10 to 15% of the natural killer cells in the endometrium. That is, 80 to 85% of the cells are present which are uterine natural killer cells. This balance is very important, and any shift in this balance, that is increase in the cytotoxic NK cells, can result in immune rejection. So this is a classic diagram which was published in 2009, which shows the characteristic pathway of antigen presentation in the lymph node, the T and B cell proliferation activation, and followed by the T and B cell effector function, that is the Th1 and Th2 response. Now, this two type of response, why is it important? Next slide, we come to know why this role of lymphocytes, and this balance is important. Like normally, the Th2 response is protective for the fetus. It protects the fetus or the embryo against immune rejection by mother. Th1 response is cytotoxic. It leads to the development of immunological response from the mother towards the fetus, and a spectrum of complications like infertility, miscarriage, preeclampsia are all part of the spectrum. So if this balance is in favor of Th2 response, then the pregnancy is protected. But if it is in favor of Th1 response, there will be all sorts of complications. Moving on to the next slide. This term also we have used, like this is different from mosaicism. Microchimerism is due to the transfer of fetal or embryological cells from the fetus to the mother. The transfer may involve trophoblastic cells, organ-specific cells which are more or less differentiated, and stem cells. And this might cause immunological response in the mother, which may result in implantation failure. Microchimerism has two phases. When on one side there is stem cell transfer, this is also a type of induced microchimerism which increases life expectancy. There is repair mechanism, there is improvement of ovarian reserve theoretically, and there is rejuvenation purposes. Whereas the same in autoimmune diseases may be detrimental. The male embryos or fetuses may synthesize or secrete a number of proteins encoded by the Y chromosomal complex, which may be unknown to the mother, and because of this opposite sex pregnancies, there is a higher percentage of complications. Now, what is the significance of this microchimerism? It might be a form of conditioning to the mother to this unknown antigens. There may be strengthening of the general vitality, or there may be priming of the mother for the foreign antigens of the fetus. So all these are speculative causes which might explain the presence of microchimerism, but there may be an opposite direction of microchimerism also, that is the maternal cells may be transferred to the fetus, and although there are less studies around it, but this is also possible theoretically. Now, what are the moving ahead from the genetics and the immunological factors associated with recurrent implantation failure, coming to the more practical aspects, that is how do we investigate into a cause of RIF? First of all, who should we investigate? Is there any recurrent miscarriage strategy? Ideally, it is what most of the journals or most of the studies have advised is that if there is failure of at least 2 to 3 IVF cycles in which sufficiently good quality embryos were transferred, or at least 4 good quality embryos were transferred, then investigations should be started on a prompt basis. Investigation should include definitely the following aspects, which includes the evaluation of the morphology, that is the evaluation of the uterine cavity, which might be assessed by HSG, saline HSG, hycosis, hysteroscopy, etc. Coagulation issues, lupus, anticoagulant, thrombophilia, and clotting screen. Immunological, like anticardiolipin, antithyroid, antiproteins, but majority of the causes cannot be evaluated because of the paucity of the test. Now, what are the major tests that we need to do in a case of RIF? This was very nicely enumerated by Simon and Loeffler in 2012 in the Journal of Reproductive Medicine, and also Kugler et al. Demonstrated this in the Journal of Reproductive Medicine in 2013. What are the investigations that need to be done? Include hysteroscopy for any intrauterine pathology, transvaginal sonography or MRI for structural uterine anomalies, HSG for hydrosalpingosis, which is not required practically because ultrasound is able to quite sufficiently diagnose the hydrosalpingosis, hormonal profile in case of endometrial defects secondary to endocrine aberrations, endometrial biopsy for uterine natural killer cells, blood tests for thrombophilia and anti-phospholipid antibodies, which include the LSC, anti-beta-2 glycoprotein tests, and all other tests for HLA matching, if it's feasible, should be advised in the case of recurrent implantation failure. Now, let us move ahead regarding hysteroscopy. So, is routine hysteroscopy recommended before all the IVF cycles in order to just detect if there is any factor which may cause IVF failure? Because many centers are doing routine hysteroscopy prior to any IVF cycle, whether there is implantation failure in the previous cycle or not. So, two important studies were there. First is the INSIGHT study, and second is the TROPHY study. Now, these are very important studies which was published in the Fertility and Sterility Journal. The TROPHY study examined around 652 cases. 350 cases were in the pre-hysteroscopy group, that is before IVF and diagnostic hysteroscopy was performed, whereas 352 no hysteroscopy was performed. There was no demonstrable differences in the live birth rates. Live birth rate was 29% in both the groups. So what they concluded in this study is that routine OPD hysteroscopy or diagnostic hysteroscopy prior to IVF cycle without any history of implantation failure is not recommended, as it doesn't improve the live birth rate or the success rates. In case of the INSIGHT study, they also compared the same two parameters, whether routine hysteroscopy should be done prior to the IVF cycles. They found that in the hysteroscopy group, they had a live birth rate of 57%, whereas in no hysteroscopy group, it was 54%. So the difference between the two groups was not significant. So the conclusion that was drawn is that routine hysteroscopy does not improve live birth rate if the ultrasonography is normal. So if there is no history of recurrent implantation failure, routine hysteroscopy is not recommended. But if there is implantation failure, definitely routine hysteroscopy is recommended. Now moving ahead to the next slide. We have another study which has evaluated the value of hysteroscopic septoplasty on the live birth rate or pregnancy rates. This was an important study which was done by Thomas Amick in 2010, and it was published in the Reproductive Biomedical Journal. He had analyzed about 827 subjects, which he divided into two groups. One group contained 289 subjects who did not undergo hysteroscopic septoplasty, and he evaluated the pregnancy rates and the live birth rates. And another group included 538 subjects who underwent hysteroscopic septoplasty, and then he compared the pregnancy rates and live birth rates. Definitely the result was as expected, that is pregnancy rate and live birth rates were definitely higher in the septoplasty group, whereas the pregnancy rate was only 9.6% and live birth rate was 1.9% in the no hysteroscopy group. Whereas in the septoplasty group, it was 43.6% and 38.6% respectively. So definitely in ultrasonically detected septum, hysteroscopic septoplasty is recommended in order to improve implantation rates, pregnancy rates, as well as to reduce the miscarriage rates. Next, moving ahead. Effect of hydrosalpinx, we have already discussed what is the effect of hydrosalpinx on the endometrium or the embryo, which may result in negative impact. There was a study which I have just put here. It is a Cochrane review which is published in the Journal of Human Reproduction in 2002. It contained it included 3 randomized controlled trials. It was done by N.P. Johnson and et al. In 2002, and they compared the pregnancy rates and live birth rates, and they found that lap salpingectomy, if there is a ultrasonically detected hydrosalpinx, definitely improves the odds of pregnancy rates and live birth rates. But there was no significant differences in the implantation rates, ectopic rates, or pregnancy or miscarriages. So definitely pregnancy rates and live birth rates were improved, and so salpingectomy or tubal clipping, whichever is practiced, is definitely recommended laparoscopically prior to the transfer. Now, the effect of adenomyosis, we all know adenomyosis is a quite rampant disease, but its direct effect on implantation is unknown. Maybe there is altered expression of the endometrial expression of integrins, altered blood supply, which might affect for it. But in this cases, GnRH depot preparations, which are administered prior to that of the embryo transfer, are found to improve the integrin expression as well as the blood flow, because of which the outcome improves. So this is another study which I have just put forward. They have also concluded the same thing, that GnRH therapy is recommended prior to embryo transfer in case of adenomyosis, in case of recurrent implantation failure. Now, another study was done. This we have already seen in another webinar, which was presented a few days ago, in which they had explained about the endometrial gene expression and the signature of the accurate endometrial signature, which we know as endometrial receptive array, in which they made the ERA test in 43 subjects who had recurrent implantation failure. Sample was taken in the mid-luteal period in the natural cycle, and this array profiling was done. And they determined the various baseline characters. As we see, I'll not go into the detail. The various baseline characters like age, BMI, the duration of infertility, treatment history. So the patients as well as the controls were more or less similar. So there was no definite disparity between them. They made the genetic, the gene profile by endometrial receptive array test of this patients, whether it is the control patient or the RIF patient, and then they were evaluated further. So what they found is the endometrial genes have a positive predictive value, especially in the recurrent implantation failure phenotype. The positive predictive value can be as high as 100%. The negative predictive value in the absence of recurrent implantation failure may be about 81%. But 1/3 of the women who had RIF had normal gene expression. So this puts this new test in our mind, which is ERA test, although it has been there for quite a long time, but still it is not done on a regular basis in our day-to-day practice. So what is the basis of this test? This was also enumerated previously in another webinar on recurrent implantation failure, that whether the presence of a good embryo is necessary for implantation. It is found that presence of a good embryo results in proliferation of the serine protease enzymes, which causes expansion of the favorable endometrial receptors and helps in implantation. There is the same in case of bad quality embryo. There is stress, proteomic stress, as a result of which there is proteolysis. So the endometrial receptors which are favorable for implantation are not proliferated, and because of this stress there might be failure of implantation. So the evaluation of this factor or this thing in the endometrium, whether the presence of a second less good embryo, like we are going for a 2 embryo or dual embryo transfer policy, does it hamper the implantation of the first embryo or not? So this is another diagram which was published by A. Richardson and Anne Rain Fanning, and they examined the presence of two, whether it is single embryo transfer or dual embryo transfer, and when two good embryos, one good, one poor, or both poor embryos are there, what are the results? So they have compared, and they definitely found when both the embryos were of good quality, then the results, whether it is clinical pregnancy or live birth, were best, and the worst results were seen when both the embryos were poor. So definitely the presence of a second less potent embryo does have a factor. The endometrial cells, stromal cells of the women in recurrent pregnancy loss or those with RIF, do they migrate to the low quality embryo? The answer is yes, because I have put forth some pictures which clearly demonstrate so. So there is endometrial support in case of poorer quality embryos, but definitely the presence of a good quality embryo will provide the counter good support required for implantation in such cases. So is implantation failure as a result of excessive selectivity? So this is a Bell diagram. In the middle portion, we have the couples who conceive naturally because they are in the favorable range. In the extreme left, due to excessive selection, we have the miscarriage group or the RIF group. And in the extreme right, we have again the conception delay group. So puts this thought. This is a food for thought that yes, implantation failure might be due to excessive selectivity of the endometrium towards good quality embryos. And this was another interesting article which was published regarding the amino acid composition of the human uterine fluid and whether it has a bearing on the implantation rates or not. It was published in the Journal of Human Reproduction in 2015 by Alexandra J. et al. And they found that what they did is they took about 43 women they took the uterine fluid sample in the mid-luteal phase, and then they determined its amino acid composition. So what they found is the total amino acid concentration is around 3.54 millimole, and there are certain essential amino acids like histidine, arginine, which are found to be present in high concentrations in this uterine fluids. So any diet which was rich in this fluids, this essential amino acids, was found to improve the composition of the uterine fluid, as a result of which implantation rates improved. So this was an important study. So till now we have discussed about the investigations of the uterine or anatomic factors. Now moving ahead to the investigations of the embryologic factors. We have the ovarian reserve tests like the basal FSH, AMH, AFC to exclude any significant compromise in ovarian function. This helps us in counseling also. Sperm DNA fragmentation, there are several assays available, whether it is the Comet assay, tunnel assay, SC assay, or a sperm chromatin dispersion test. Each test has its own plus and minus, whereas the tunnel and Comet usually help us to detect the number of breaks, whereas SCS and SCD usually help us in predicting the susceptibility of the sperm chromatin towards fragmentation. 0 to 15% of fragmentation is usually taken of good fertility potential. 15 to 25 is usually taken in a borderline zone, whereas more than 25 is usually not considered to be good and usually associated with implantation failure or miscarriages. Karyotyping should be done to rule out structural anomalies. At least 2.5% of the patients of recurrent implantation failure are associated with karyotypic anomalies, and at least 4.5% are associated with other genetic disorders like translocations and all, which are quite common, whether it may be reciprocal or Robertsonian, but they are associated with around 4.5% cases. In case of a structural anomaly, the option of PGD should be definitely offered to the couples. Now, let us discuss the embryo or the gamete-related factors in a little detail. Sperm DNA anomalies include aneuploidies, deletions, insertions, and duplications. DNA base modifications include copy number variations, mutations, and etc. In this regard, I would like to stress that DNA fragmentation and aneuploidy are not the same and therefore should not be confused. So it is seen that in cases of recurrent implantation failure, about 0.6% cases usually are aneuploid. This is in case of normal semen analysis, whereas in case of oligozoospermia or azoospermia, this increases further to 6% or 14%. 25% of the men with normal WHO semen parameters have high DNA fragmentation levels. So all this shows that DNA fragmentation index is an important parameter to be considered in RIF. Various types of aneuploidy skinning includes the older generation FISH test, which evaluated only 4 or 5 chromosomes, and the more recent comparative genomic hybridization, which helps us in evaluating all the 24 chromosomes, mutations, and deletions. Also, DNA fragmentation tests I have described in previously. But there is still lack of studies which determine any direct correlation with sperm DNA fragmentation and recurrent miscarriage. So there is lack of much amount of data so as to establish such direct correlation. Even there is no study on the WHO sperm parameters and recurrent implantation failure, because most of the studies that have been undertaken are usually of egg aneuploidy or maternal age or maternal aneuploidy, and very less number of studies are available which establish direct relationship between either sperm aneuploidy and RIF or sperm DNA fragmentation and RIF. Now, this is a study which was published in the Journal of Human Reproduction by Borrello et al. Sorry. It evaluated the outcomes after ICSI in cases of sperm aneuploidy. As expected, in cases of sperm aneuploidy, the rates of implantation and abortions, implantation rates were lower and abortion rates were higher, whereas those with normal sperms had higher implantation rates and abortion rates were lower, and practically they were zero. So definitely sperm aneuploidy does have a bearing on implantation. There is a strong correlation between sperm aneuploidy rates and embryo chromosomal constitution. That it has been found that men with increased rates of aneuploid sperm are producing significantly more number of abnormal embryos, which abnormal chromosomal constitution. 8 to 2% of the abortions were related with chromosomes of 13, 18, or 21, and they are of paternal origin. So the male factor is supposed to be taken into account. More studies are there which take into account the sperm aneuploidy and DNA fragmentation, but still sufficient sample size or data is not available. I'll just skip through the slides so that we can cover more about.
Because there are more slides left, and we have already crossed 45 minutes. So, yeah.
Okay, sir. I'll just quickly tell the slides. In which cases, why ICSI may be better in IVF in case of higher DNA fragmentation? Because at least 30% women having ICSI have eggs that can repair the sperm DNA. Their sperms are not exposed to suboptimal culture media, which occurs in conventional IVF, and the oocytes are not exposed to reactive oxygen species overnight, which occurs in IVF. So definitely the answer to this increased DNA fragmentation would be go for ICSI. So this, I'll just flip through a few slides. This slide I would like to stress on. The testicular sperms are found to have lesser reactive oxygen species, as a result which there is lesser DNA fragmentation, and some studies have utilized testicular sperm instead of ejaculated sperm so as to improve the embryo quality. Other techniques for improving the sperm DNA extraction, like microfluidic separation, electrophoretic isolation, or Zeck selector, and these are also there. Now, how to treat? First step is definitely correction of all endocrinopathies, whether it is thyroid, hyperprolactinemia, PCOS, or diabetes mellitus. This has to be undertaken, following which the treatment is to be individualized. It is a multidisciplinary approach. Definitely experienced fertility specialist is required. A senior embryologist is required. Reproductive surgeon may or may not be required, and definitely personalized approach is required. First is correction of anatomic factors, whether it is cystoscopic resection of the cavity pathology, septum, polyp, fibroids, ideally more than 4 centimeter. Should be removed. Submucous myomas should definitely be removed. Subserosal myomas, yes, we can ignore. Intramural myomas, 4 centimeter or more, definitely should be removed. Moving ahead. Treatment of thin endometrium, this we have already described in our previous webinar. The various techniques like aspirin, vaginal sildenafil, prolonged estrogen, or pentoxifylline, vitamin E, all this may be employed so as to improve the endometrial thickness as well as blood flow. Endometrial scratching, also we had discussed. Endometrial scratching is usually done in the mid-luteal phase. It is found to have a number of beneficial effects, which includes promotion of desidualization of the endometrium, as well as favorable cytokine milieu and favorable expression of the implantation molecules, integrins, etc., which result in improvement of implantation. But still more amount of data is required in case of endometrial scratching. Various studies have described different periods of endometrial scratching. Some have done it on the day of oocyte retrieval, some have done it just prior to embryo transfer, some have done in the mid-luteal phase of the prior cycle. But the ones which have described endometrial scratching in the mid-luteal cycle of the prior cycle usually have most best results. The technique of endometrial scratching I will not describe in detail. This is the mechanism of action of endometrial scratching. I have just told desidualization promotes healing, favorable cytokine milieu, and recruitment of the stem cells to the endometrium. Treatment of thrombophilia. Yes, thrombophilia does pose a major problem. We are all are doing this in our day-to-day practice. We're supplementing with low molecular with heparin plus minus aspirin. Addition of aspirin, if the patient had previous clotting history, there is no benefit, additional benefit. But if there is no previous clotting history, yes, addition of aspirin along with low molecular with heparin is beneficial, especially in on antiphospholipid syndrome can be done. And the dosage is usually recommended is 40 milligram subcutaneously daily, which is people have usually started it from 6 to 7 weeks uh, at the time when we usually call the patient for their first ultrasound, and it is continued till postpartum period also, say 5 to 6 weeks postpartum. Immunotherapy, IVIG, various studies have evaluated the efficacy of IVIG. The dosages of IVIG, usually there is a standard dosage of about 400 to 500 milligram per kg, whereas in case of low dose protocols, it is 200 to 400 milligram. The data for IVIG in favor of IVIG is quite less, and so more data is required. The evidence is not there still in favor of IVIG. Intralipid is a fat emulsion which is known to modulate the immune response in the mother in favor of the embryo, so that the implantation rates are improved, but still less quality of evidence is there. But yes, might be tried in cases by informing the patients about the plus minus of the therapy. Intrauterine administration of autologous peripheral blood mononuclear cells. This is freshly isolated from the patients, effectively improves the embryo implantation found in this studies in 2006-2011. They evoke a favorable inflammatory reaction due to the production of favorable cytokines, and they also secrete proteases to regulate the endometrial function. Treatment of the embryos, yes, definitely PGS might be offered, in which there is no clear-cut distinction or clear-cut reason for RIF. Now, regarding the PGD and PGS, those studies which have utilized the older technique of FISH in PGD, they have found an increased rate of aneuploidy in those having RIF, whereas those who have undertaken studies with CGH, they have not found any increase in rates of aneuploidy in those having RIF. More data using CGH array is required because most of the studies have used the FISH test, which is the older technique. Regarding PGS, most of the studies which have evaluated the effect of pregnancy rates pre-PGS or no with PGS or without PGS, they have found that there is no significant difference. So whether this should be offered routinely, it is a no. That is, routine PGS shouldn't be offered. Those above the age of 38 years or having history of RIF might be offered. Yes. These are the genetic chromosomal abnormalities which are seen in case of recurrent pregnancy loss or RIF. I'll not go into the details, but definitely karyotype evaluation, parental karyotype, looking for embryo aneuploidy, gene mutations and polymorphism, as well as endometrial gene profiling is important. Oocyte, we all know, consists of the major chunk of the incompetency or the factor for RIF, includes the variety of disorders like imprinting, failure of fertilization, abnormal cell fate, embryo lethality, aneuploidy, failure, everything. So the oocyte is quite vital and has to be evaluated. We all know how the fertility, fertilization rate, implantation rate, as well as the rates of aneuploidy increases after 35 years of age. So all these studies have evaluated these factors. And this is an important chart which was published in 2013, which evaluated the effect of PGS and no PGS in those having RIF. So we find that those who underwent PGS in RIF showed improved result, which was contradictory to what the later studies have found. All this is because of the different technique that has been used, because this is an older study which was published in 2013 and it utilized FISH, but the present more recent studies are utilizing CGH array and they did not find any significant difference between these two. So this conclusion I have already told, that it should not be routinely offered. It should be offered to a subset of population who might benefit with PGS. A small note on methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase enzyme. which is associated with hyperhomocystinemia, because which might be a cause of recurrent implantation failure or pregnancy loss. These are the genetics involved. I'll not go into the detail. Some centers have also tested for it, and it is found to be an important factor which might cause recurrent implantation failure. For the treatment of sperm DNA fragmentation, several strategies are undertaken, like antioxidant supplementation, use of testicular spermatozoa, selection of sperms with lesser fragmentation by using annexin B columns, conofocal spectral microscopy, or sperm hyaluronic acid binding, which is PIXI. So all these techniques are employed, and IMSI is also there, so as to select sperm with lesser number of vacuoles, which might improve the outcome. But IMSI in larger studies is not found to be quite beneficial. This is the technique of PIXI, which I have highlighted. Use of testicular spermatozoa, I have already told, they are associated with lesser reactive oxygen damage and lesser DNA fragmentation. Assisted hatching. So this is an important thing. Zona hardening, which might occur in a significant population of RIF, which is a natural phenomenon. And 3 RCTs were there, which I have highlighted. They have found that assisted hatching, whether it is chemical, laser induced, or enzymatic, does improve the clinical pregnancy rate. Now, which type of assisted hatching should be done is debatable. But yes, laser diode assisted hatching is associated with higher implantation and pregnancy rate as compared to the other methods of assisted hatching. Suboptimal co-culture. This co-culture concept has come up in a refurbished fashion in recent times. In this, the embryo is co-cultured with homologous, either it may endometrial cells, fallopian tube cells, or ovarian cells. There is homologous cells. People have also tried culturing the embryo with cells derived from bovine or embryos, bovine or murine cells, but because of associated transmission of infections or other diseases, usually homologous co-culture is only preferred, and they have found an improvement in embryo quality as well as improvement in the rates of implantation. Blastocyst culture we all are doing. The activation of embryonic genome usually takes place around the 3rd day, and therefore proceeding with a blastocyst culture or going for a blastocyst transfer definitely helps us in selecting embryos with better fertility potential and improved implantation rates. Improving the technique of embryo transfer, yes, we all encounter cases of difficult embryo transfer, and various guidelines are there, like avoidance of blood, aspiration of the mucus, avoiding bacterial contamination, avoiding touching the fundus, and avoiding uterine contractions. All this trial transfer, partially filled bladder, soft catheter, all these techniques are employed so as to improve our embryo transfer technique. Fibrin glue has also come up so as to improve the implantation rates. There are very few studies regarding the use of glue and its efficacy, but evidence suggests that improved clinical pregnancy and live birth rates by using hyaluronic acid as an adherence compound in some cycles. This was a Cochrane review which was published 2014, but solid evidence or data is not available. So we cannot recommend embryo glue on and off. Antioxidants, yes, definitely, empirically they do work. The balance, especially in RIF or those with higher DNA fragmentation, is in favor of supplementing with antioxidants. Personalized embryo transfer in terms of determining, doing the ERA test and determining the personalized window of implantation and doing in that might be tried, but because it is an expensive test, patient counseling is important. This is here this technique of ERA is described, which I'll not go in detail. Vitamin D supplementation, yes, there was recently a study which found out the importance of vitamin D in cases of recurrent implantation failure as well as recurrent miscarriages. It was published in 2017 in the Journal of Human Reproduction by Kunyaki Ota, and what it found is that it included 133 women. 63 had low vitamin D, which the level was less than 30 nanogram, which was taken as the criteria. They found that there was an increase in the number of anti-nuclear antibodies, anti-phospholipid antibodies, and so definitely vitamin D supplementation, they found that helped in improvement of the implantation rates. So there is another, this is another study which evaluated the effect of multivitamin and mineral tablets, and they found that yes, it is associated with improved implantation rate. Vitamin D, the recommended dose is usually 50,000 international unit of vitamin D2 or D3 once a week injection for 8 weeks, or the oral dosage may be 6,000 international unit orally each day for 8 weeks, which may be given. Corticosteroids, the dose of prednisolone, there is very less evidence. Even the Cochrane also doesn't give any clear-cut evidence. But yes, many centers, because of the immunomodulatory effect, have tied corticosteroids. Recommended dose is around 20 mg to be started around the period of embryo transfer and is to be continued. Various Chinese herbs, acupuncture, all sorts of empiric treatment have been tried. Heparin I have described previously in also like in what regimen we have to use in thrombophilia cases. Multifactorial treatment options include lifestyle changes, avoidance of smoking, alcohol, lowering of or control of BMI, salpingectomy for hydrosalpinges. Definitely all these factors improve in the clinical pregnancy rates. In case of adenomyosis or endometriosis, GnRH depot preparations 3 to 6 months prior to ART is found to be beneficial. Endometrioma removal routinely is not found to be beneficial for implantation. Danazol is associated with immunosuppressive effects, increases the receptivity and expression of the receptive molecules, and is associated with increased clinical pregnancy rates. Tailoring the stimulation protocols like using GnRH agonist or antagonist according to the patient, that is personalized stimulation protocols. Addition of LH in poor responders who responded poorly to only FSH in the previous stimulation cycles, or those who are above 35 years. Going for natural cycle which produces lesser estrogen levels so that the endometrial profiling is not altered and the uterine natural killer cell count is maintained. And in a country like India, we have to mention definitely the role of re-ATT, in especially the AFB positive or IGRA test positive. The role of re-ATT is also to be considered. Some new theories have also come up, like this is a study which was published in the Fertility and Sterility Journal recently in September 2017. And they have recommended the short-term use of copper intrauterine device for a small period, which improve the pregnancy rates in cases of recurrent implantation failure. So this is a new concept which has come up, and although they found a significant higher implantation rates, 29% versus those who were not inserted, there's 16%. But the larger studies are needed so that we can implement this. Immunomodulation treatments are also coming up, which include mitochondrial replacement, as the oocyte is found to be inefficient. So a portion of the cytoplasm of a foreign oocyte, say donor oocyte, is taken and it is injected into the maternal oocyte, replenishing all the mitochondrial factors as well as the deficient factors, and this is found to improve the pregnancy rates. TNF alpha, which is a negative factor towards implantation. Adalimumab is the main anti-TNF alpha agent is used. 2 doses are recommended, separated by a period of 15 days, but larger randomized studies are needed to recommend its usage in day-to-day life. So let us just quickly come to the conclusion, because many things, many items we have discussed, and so it might be confusing. Many known and unknown reasons for recurrent implantation failure are there, but we do not have the tools to diagnose each and every case or exact cause. After failure of at least 2 to 3 transfers of good quality embryos in which there was no pregnancy, then we should take some measures. The management of recurrent implantation failure should definitely be individualized and multidisciplinary. So with that, I would like to just sum up, and I would like to ask if there is any question or any doubt, because I have 1 or 2 doubts which I would definitely like to put forth, and I have tried to sum up the major points, but definitely a lot remains since it is a huge topic. Thank you.
All of you, you can type your questions in the chat box on the right bottom that you see. The bottommost right corner, you can see type your message. There you can type and ask your questions, whatever you.
Yes, I can see Dr. Vinod has asked about the injection role of injection atrocybin. Yes, many centers, not many, some centers have used injection atrocybin prior to embryo transfer in order to prevent the uterine contractions. But as with most of the treatments, we need larger trials or larger evidence so as to recommend its usage on daily means routine practice, because larger evidence is not there. But yes, some centers have used and they have found results. So I wish to ask one question which I was not able to, like when I was going through the article for IVIG therapy, I found that the recommended dosage for IVIG in the standard dosage is around 400 milligram, whereas a low dosage protocol is also there, which is around 200 milligram. But the Bharglobe which we are using in our centers, it has a composition of around 16.5% and it is available in a volume of around 1 ml. So the amount that we should be giving, even if we are following the low dose protocol, should be quite high. So how does it correlate? Like we are giving 1 ml every 3 weeks. So I could not understand the dosage protocol, because it is this composition is almost like that.
Experience on using Bhaglob. Maybe if any fetal medicine or Dr. Vipin is there, he can answer, or any one of you. If anyone has an experience, you can type in your answer in the chat box. So that'll be good. We have started for some of our patients. I
Yes.
think 4 patients have undergone late. Two
Yes.
patients had conceived also. One of them unfortunately aborted, but the one I remember in Patna is going on after 3 IVF failures with cycle. The fourth again was done with a self cycle after the late therapy, and she's successfully going. Probably should be 16 weeks plus now.
Yes, even 2 patients from our center have also gone to Mumbai for the lead therapy, and we are awaiting their results because they are still in the process of the therapy. Yes, lead therapy does appear to be promising. Because of the cost-related issues and practical considerations, we're not able to implement it on a larger scale, but it does have a role. I can see one question on injection of seminal plasma intrauterine. We have not practiced in any of our centers, like in Delhi at least. So I would like to pass on this question to Kshitij sir if he has any take on the injection of seminal plasma intrauterine, because we do not have any experience here on the use of this in case of RIF.
No, no, no. We've never tried this any
Yes.
time. I don't know.
So since we have never tried, or so I would not be able to comment on this. I can see one question in which, in case of HLA sharing between husband and wife in non-consanguineous marriage, what do you suggest should be done? Routinely, testing for HLA genes sharing should not be done. If it is a non-consanguineous one, it is implied that the level of HLA sharing will not be to the detrimental levels. But if it is between close relatives, say brother, sister, first degree relatives, then definitely we know because of the heredity, there will be HLA sharing. And if they are presenting with recurrent implantation failures or recurrent miscarriages, then in those cases, HLA sharing testing may be recommended. It is not advisable to recommend it routinely, and not in non-consanguineous marriage if they do not have any issue of RPL or RIF. Diabetes, one question on diabetes is there. If the husband is diabetic, does his chance of aneuploidy or sperm DNA fragment? Yes, sperm DNA fragmentation does have a role. It is increased in diabetics, but aneuploidy, there is as such no study which relates this directly to the diabetic status. Yes, DNA fragmentation, as I have highlighted in this, has a role in the embryo quality as well as the implantation, and definitely better control of the diabetic status will improve the semen quality in terms of DNA fragmentation. But as in our most of our centers, we are going for ICSI. DNA fragmentation doesn't have any direct implication if we are going for ICSI. It is a strong negative impact if you are going for IUI, a moderate negative impact if you are going for conventional IVF, but there is no impact if you are going for ICSI. So we need not be very much concerned about DNA fragmentation at present, but yes, higher levels, say more than 40, are to be dealt with. Antioxidant supplementation, sugar control, healthy lifestyle, all this are definitely recommended. Any role of injection DECA on the day of ET in RIF? The therapy which you are recommending is a mode of luteal phase support that has been used. Yes, defective luteal phase defect might be associated with implantation failure. Various methods of luteal phase support are utilized. This GnRH agonist injection on the day of ET helps in improving the support of the corpus luteum, and later on provides support of the luteal phase. It might be effective, but has not been tried by any major studies. So this has been used in terms of providing luteal phase support, but specifically in RIF, there are no major studies as far as I know. Okay, I have another question. In RIF, the window of implantation is delayed by 2 days. So we have two options: transferring one day 3 embryo and one blastocyst on day 5, or 2 blastocysts on day 7. How feasible are these two options? I think the first option which you have said, going for sequential transfer, I have found about 2 studies in which they have recommended that going for sequential transfer is a good option in such cases. Going for a day 7 transfer might not be a better one. This is my personal opinion. I would like to ask Sir's opinion also, Kshitij Sir's opinion also. What does he feel? Which of this is better? I personally am in favor of the sequential transfer one.
I think, Shubdeep, as you pointed out in the first slide, that RIF is still a very doubtful diagnosis. It seems like RIF, you have to believe. But I would again urge all of you to first stick to the basics of our education. First, do the common things first. If still the patient does not receive, then start thinking of these, variations that you pointed out. It's nice to discuss and have questions around newer strategies, but can we actually put it into routine clinical practice is a big question. Until unless we have our own robust data or somebody else's data to prove that these variations do effectively work in a RIF patient. So I would again urge that everyone to stick to the basics first, and then maybe in few patients try out these options and see if this works.
Yes, very well said, sir. And we have some other questions also, like we have a question on myomas. A patient with 3 previous IVF failures with intramural myoma, 3.5 centimeter, not indenting endometrium, myomectomy advisable? Only GnRH agonist. Definitely, if she is having 3 previous IVF failures, if there is a myoma, I would be more in favor of going for myomectomy, because if the same patient was there with no, say, 1 IVF failure or no IVF failures, I would not have gone for myomectomy. But in this case, I would be more in support of myomectomy, because many times it is seen that myoma, even if it is not indenting the endometrium or it is impinging into the endometrium, is affecting the endometrium in other ways. Like it might be hampering the blood supply, it might be altering the expression of the adhesion molecules, or there may be an unfavorable milieu of cytokines, which we cannot measure by any tests. So with such a history, I would definitely go in favor of myomectomy, because it's easier for us to counsel the patient also, that since there is a history of failure, definitely we should be doing something extra which was not done till date, and removal is a logical decision in such case. There is another question in which asked by Dr. Jyoti, that I have a patient, previous 3 missed abortions, HLA shedding shown in immunologic testing. Do you find any studies what best can be done for them? I think since there is history of HLA sharing, oocyte or embryo donation would be an option for them. Because even if we are going for oocyte donation cycle, then we are having at least 50% mismatch in the HLA, which might improve the outcome. In case of embryo donation, it becomes 100%. So definitely oocyte or embryo donation might be a solution in this case. We have another question. Do you have any more information on intralipid? I have started in. Okay. Yes, I do have. I have a few articles with me. This is asked by Dr. Sham. Dr. Sham, you can take the studies from me. Yes, I have, but I couldn't include it into the slides because already the slides were quite high in numbers. So I will give you the details. Intralipid does, I have two studies on intralipid, but definitely they are not such sufficient strength that they might be implemented on a regular basis. Okay, I think we have come. Yes, we are having some opinions also, like implications of DNI and ICSI and whether myomectomy should be done. I think, as Shritit sir said, this debate will go on because RIF is a very vast topic. Some areas are very gray till date, and they are very shady also. And because we are from different school of thoughts, we have different opinions, we follow different guidelines, or it is very important, as sir said, that we should stick to the basics, and definitely the newer therapies might be tried after proper counseling and informed consent in selected group of patients. So I think that should be the take home message from this webinar. So I guess since it is the end of the questionnaire round, I would like to just end this session, and I hope everybody who was there have gained some knowledge, and I have also gained some knowledge because I came to know of many new things in this webinar.
All right. Thank you, Shruti. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. And thank you,
Yeah, you
everybody.
can end the session now.
Okay, sir.